When the war ended, the world was a scrapyard of twisted metal and unanswered questions. From the ruins of the Reich came crates, barrels, and shattered weapons that once formed the backbone of the most feared army on Earth. Among the relics that caught American attention, none carried a reputation as darkly respected as the German 8.8mm flak gun. Soldiers who'd survived North Africa, Italy, and Normandy still spoke of it with an unease that time had not dulled. The 88 was more than a gun. It was a symbol of precision, born from desperation. The thunder that had torn through tank armor, bombers, and the nerves of men alike. And when American scientists finally obtained several intact batteries and their last generation of ammunition, curiosity turned into reverence, then into something colder, dread disguised as fascination. The crates arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground under heavy guard, their stenciled German markings barely legible beneath soot and rust. Technicians pried them open to find shells that seemed at first crude, even unfinished. The outer casings bore uneven seams, their paint scuffed by rushed production. But when they were dismantled, layer by layer, what lay within told another story entirely. Inside these imperfect shells was the culmination of a dying regime's obsession with control over chaos. The fuses were not the same as those recovered earlier in the war. These were new, compact, almost elegant, with fine internal mechanisms that seemed far beyond what a collapsing Germany should have been capable of manufacturing in 1945. The metallurgists began their analysis in silence. They melted fragments, weighed traces of tungsten and chromium, tested micro-hardness. What they found defied logic. Alloys too pure for the conditions Germany was supposedly enduring. There were rumors, whispered among the scientists, that these late-war batches had come from the underground Mittelwerk facilities, where slave laborers toiled under torchlight, machining death while their own lives were measured in days. If that was true, then these shells were built on suffering so intense it could be felt in the metal itself. Still, the craftsmanship spoke of minds unwilling to surrender to decay. Some engineers said the precision reminded them of pre-war Swiss instruments. Others simply stared and said nothing. What unnerved them most wasn't the metallurgy or the design. It was the implication. Somewhere, even as the Reich burned, someone had kept thinking, improving, refining the art of destruction. When the first test firing was scheduled, the atmosphere was thick with a kind of ceremonial tension. The gun had been reassembled meticulously, down to the grease patterns left by its last German crew. American ordnance officers stood beside it, notebooks in hand, as if watching a relic of some extinct predator being awakened for study. The target drone, a stripped-down aircraft fitted with a telemetry receiver, buzzed into the clear Maryland sky. On command, the gun fired. The shockwave hit the observers like a physical blow, echoing across the proving ground with an almost personal aggression. Seconds later, the shell detonated. The drone vanished into fragments so fine that for a moment, no one could tell if they'd even seen it destroyed or merely imagined it. The telemetry confirmed it, a perfect intercept, at a timing so precise that deviation was less than a tenth of what American radar-directed guns could achieve. The officers stood speechless. In the control tower, Major Haskins, the supervising officer, removed his headset and looked at the engineers with disbelief that bordered on guilt. If they had more of these, he muttered, we'd still be fighting over Europe. No one contradicted him. They all knew he was right. The report filed later that week would conclude, in the dry language of bureaucracy, that the efficiency of late-model Flak 88 ammunition exceeds current US standards for anti-aircraft precision under comparable conditions. But those words concealed a deeper unease. The Americans hadn't just learned something about enemy engineering. They'd glimpsed how close the balance of air superiority had come to shifting in the final months of the war. What haunted them most was the fuse. Its timing circuit was unlike any they had seen, suggesting experimentation with near-proximity detonation principle that predated the American VT fuse by several months. The implications were staggering. If the Germans had perfected it earlier, or had the resources to produce it in scale, the Allied bombing campaign might have become a massacre. The skies over Berlin and Hamburg could have turned into graveyards for B-17s and Lancasters long before the war's end. One of the scientists, a quiet man named Reynolds, wrote in his diary that night, "We may not have beaten their guns. We simply buried the factories faster than they could build them." That sentence, though never published, captured the truth that data alone could not. Superiority, it turned out, was as much a matter of exhaustion as innovation. Weeks passed, and the tests continued. Each round fired yielded the same result: unerring accuracy, devastating effect, almost uncanny synchronization between detonation and trajectory. It wasn't just mechanical genius, it was the last whisper of a nation that had poured its soul into destruction. As more results came in, the atmosphere at Aberdeen shifted from excitement to quiet reverence. The Flak 88, stripped of ideology and context, stood as an artifact of human obsession with perfection in the service of death. In the briefing room, one engineer summed it up in a single line: "They didn't lose the air war because their guns failed. They lost it because their country collapsed before their guns could finish the job." And so the American scientists packed their notes, stored the remaining shells, and wrote reports that would shape ordnance development for a decade to come. But there was an unspoken understanding that lingered long after the files were archived. The war had ended, yes, but not the rivalry that had driven it. Every breakthrough, every innovation recovered from the ruins, became a seed for the next generation of weaponry. In a sense, the Flak 88 had not died, it had merely changed sides. If you've made it to this point in the story, take a second to comment where you're watching from. It helps bring this history to more people who still care to understand how close we came to losing the skies. The more they tested, the more uneasy they became. What had started as a technical curiosity turned into an existential reckoning for the men at Aberdeen. The data from the range spoke louder than any report or intelligence briefing ever could. Each firing reinforced a simple, horrifying truth. The German Flak 88 had not been an outdated weapon by 1945. It had been evolving faster than American analysts had imagined. Every new shell they disassembled revealed refinements that shouldn't have existed in a nation being bombed into ash. A fuse adjustment here, a reshaped driving band there, tiny details invisible to the naked eye but catastrophic in their combined effect. Each modification pointed to a philosophy of warfare that saw precision not as luxury, but as survival. And in that pursuit, the Germans had been only a few steps away from shattering the illusion of Allied air dominance. The officers overseeing the project gathered nightly in a dim briefing room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and unease. On a wall-length chart, rows of data showed the correlation between detonation timing and altitude, fragments dispersal, target velocity, and hit probability. Every line that climbed toward perfection was a wound to their pride. One colonel compared the new German fuse designs to the early prototypes of the American VT proximity fuse, only to realize the Germans had nearly reached the same level of sophistication without radar miniaturization. They had achieved proximity detonation through analog precision, clockwork, not circuits, a feat considered impossible by most Allied ordnance experts. That discovery alone ignited a quiet panic. If such a system had been fielded even in small numbers, the daylight bombing runs over the Ruhr and Berlin could have turned into killing field. The American air crews who had already faced nightmarish flak corridors might never have made it home at all. As these revelations spread through the test team, the tone of the project shifted from analysis to confession. Engineers began rereading mission log from the 8th Air Force, comparing loss patterns and dates, matching them against what they now knew about the Flak 88's evolving design. The pattern was unmistakable. Starting in late 1944, bomber losses had surged in specific sectors despite improved formation tactics and escort coverage. At the time, it had been blamed on weather, fatigue, or bad intelligence. Now the truth began to surface. The Germans had quietly introduced these new shells in small quantities, testing them under fire. The scientists realized they had been analyzing the reason behind the sudden spike in B-17 and B-24 casualties without even knowing it during the war. A chill ran through the room when one of the younger technicians pointed out that the Luftwaffe hadn't needed to win the skies. They'd only needed to make the price of flying unbearable. The conclusions from Aberdeen were not publicly shared. Officially, the war was over, victory secured, and American air power had proven unassailable. But in the quiet corners of military intelligence, there was an unspoken question. How close had they come to losing that advantage? Reports sent to Washington warned that late-war German flak technology represented a leap in efficiency that could not be ignored. Even stripped of its propaganda, the evidence was undeniable. The shell's timing mechanisms displayed an understanding of atmospheric variables and ballistic arc behavior that surpassed US production standards. They weren't guessing their shots, they were calculating. The men in charge of air operations who reviewed the findings saw the implications immediately. Air superiority had not been guaranteed by courage or numbers alone. It had depended on the enemy's inability to keep up. The The Germans had come terrifyingly close to catching up. Reynolds, the same quiet scientist who had written his private note about the factory, became obsessed with reconstructing the fuse system. For weeks he barely slept, surrounded by dissected fragments, scribbling equations and notes in the margins of German blueprints. One evening, as a storm rolled over the Chesapeake, he called Major Haskins to his lab. On the table lay a half-assembled German fuse connected to a crude American sensor array. Reynolds gestured to it without a word. When activated, the mechanism responded to the simulated signal in perfect synchronization, detonating at a calculated distance, precise, flawless. "They solved it," he said softly. "Without electronics, without us." The Major said nothing, only watched as the last trace of smoke from the test lingered in the lab's stale air. It was a moment of reluctant admiration, tinged with something darker, the realization that brilliance and brutality often walked hand in hand. By late summer, the Aberdeen findings were feeding into new American program. Engineers used what they'd learned from the German shells to improve fuse reliability, timing accuracy, and fragmentation efficiency. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very weapon that had once slaughtered Allied crews was now reshaping the future of US order. What had been an artifact of defeat was becoming a blueprint for dominance. But beneath the progress reports and design diagram, a quiet bitterness persisted. The men who had seen what those shells could do never fully shook the feeling that the war's outcome had hinged not on superiority, but on timing, on who had run out of resources first. In the months that followed, a few of the scientists left the project. Others moved on to new programs: jet propulsion, missile defense, radar countermeasures. Yet the shadow of the 88 followed them all. In their dreams, they still heard the sound of that first test firing, the echo of a weapon that seemed almost alive in its precision. They had stared into the machinery of an enemy's genius and found, to their discomfort, a mirror. If you've been following this story, take a moment to subscribe. There's more coming. Stories of how knowledge captured from the ruins of one empire became the foundation of another. And this one, about the gun that almost won back the skies, is only the beginning. By autumn of 1945, Aberdeen's test ranges had become a stage for something almost ritualistic. Every morning, under the grey light that came off the Chesapeake, teams of engineers, soldiers, and observers took their places as another German gun thundered its echo across the proving ground. It wasn't just testing anymore. It was archaeology, the unearthing of a weapon's ghost, dissecting its final secrets one detonation at a time. The Flak 88 stood on its platform like a monument to lost precision, its barrel dark with residue and oil, its wheels locked into concrete. The Americans treated it with a respect that bordered on reverence. Even the ordnance crew that loaded the shells handled them with the wary care of men touching something both sacred and cursed. The sound it made when firing had a weight that went beyond physics, a sonic reminder of the fear that gun had once inspired in every Allied pilot who flew through its reach. The tests grew more ambitious. They simulated bomber formations, launching multiple drones at varying altitudes and speeds to replicate B-17 attack runs. They fed the gun data from captured German range tables, aligning their fire just as a flak crew might have done outside Kassel or over the Ruhr. When the first volley went up, the sky bloomed with orange and black flowers of shrapnel, each explosion occurring with a precision that sent chills through the observers. The fragments tore through the drones like invisible blades. On the radar screens, the readouts looked less like random bursts and more like a web, a calculated net of destruction cast exactly where the planes would have flown. The officers watching realized they were seeing the practical expression of something far beyond simple ballistics. It was mathematics turned into death, pure and deliberate. The results stunned even the veterans in attendance. Colonel Draper, who had commanded a bomber wing in '44, watched the data printouts with a frozen expression. "That's the pattern," he said quietly, pointing to a section of the chart. "That's exactly what we flew into over Bremen. We thought it was random fire. It wasn't." The room fell silent. Every pilot's nightmare, every chaotic memory of flak bursts that seemed impossibly well-timed, suddenly gained structure. It hadn't been luck or coincidence. The Germans had built predictability into terror. Draper leaned back in his chair and whispered, "They weren't missing. We were just too slow to understand." The discovery changed the tone of everything. What had begun as curiosity now felt like an indictment. For years, the Allied narrative had painted the German air defenses as increasingly desperate, overstrained, underpowered, drowning beneath the Allied offensive. Now, looking at these late shells, it became clear that beneath that chaos had been a grim, methodical intelligence, still refining its craft. Even as their cities were leveled, they'd found ways to squeeze more accuracy from less material, more lethality from fewer resources. One of the younger ordnance officers wrote in his notebook, "They didn't lose because they ran out of ideas. They lost because they ran out of time." The technical reports grew thicker, each page filled with equations, metallurgical notes, fuse schematic, and hand-drawn diagrams. They began comparing German test log recovered from captured depots, fragments of data scribbled in pencil, marked Versuchsreihe 1940-45. Those records confirmed the Americans' worst suspicions. The late-war Flak 88 shells had been part of a broader experiment to integrate primitive predictive systems with optical rangefinding. In other words, the Germans had been attempting to automate flak in a world still years away from digital computation. They were already reaching for it through mechanical cams, gears, and analog relays that could adjust fire solutions in milliseconds. It was the embryo of what would one day become guided air defense, and it had been sitting, forgotten, beneath the rubble of a destroyed nation. In one of the final full-scale tests, the Aberdeen team decided to simulate a scenario using American bombers fitted with motion sensors, flying through the gun's effective range at high altitude. The idea was to see whether the German predictive models could actually match moving formations under real conditions. They expected near misses. What they got was near obliteration. Out of 6 drones, 5 were hit within the first 2 salvos. The last one, fleeing toward the horizon, was clipped by shrapnel that detonated right at its engine housing. It spiraled down into the marsh, burning. When the smoke cleared, Reynolds stood at the edge of the range, notebook in hand, staring at the crater where the last shell had hit. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his words came out in a flat murmur. "That's it," he said. "That's why we almost lost the skies." Back in Washington, the results sent quiet ripples through the Air Corps and Ordnance Board. No one wanted the story to reach the press. The official line remained that the German defences had been overwhelmed by sheer Allied might, that the bombing campaign's success was inevitable. But the men who had seen the data knew better. They knew that superiority had balanced on a knife's edge, that a few months more of production, a few more shipments of these refined shells, could have turned the air war into a bloodbath. They also knew that history would not remember how close it had been. At night, some of them stayed in their quarters, long after the lights went out, staring at ceiling shadows, hearing again the thump of the 88 and the whistle of imaginary shells cutting the air. The past had come alive under controlled conditions, and it refused to go quietly back to sleep. The war was over, but the echo of that gun, that perfect, terrible instrument, lingered like an unanswered question. The Aberdeen project eventually wound down, its results classified and filed away, stamped with layers of bureaucratic secrecy. But every man who had been there carried a piece of it with him. They had seen what German engineering had done in its final breath, and what it could still teach. For some, it was a source of pride, proof that even in victory, there was still something to learn. For others, it was a burden, a reminder that the line between ingenuity and annihilation had never been thinner. If this story makes you think about how fragile victory can be, about how often it depends on the mistakes of those we fight, take a moment to subscribe. There's more coming, and the next part will show how the lessons of that discovery didn't stay buried for long. By early 1946, the Aberdeen Proving Ground had become more than a testing site. It was a bridge from one war to another that hadn't yet begun. The Cold War was still an unspoken phrase, but the men there could feel its presence, coiling quietly behind every experiment. The captured Flak 88s were no longer curiosities of a defeated enemy. They were blueprints for a future no one fully understood. In locked hangars and sealed laboratories, engineers worked around the clock, rebuilding, modifying, experimenting. The German fuses were taken apart again and again until every gear, spring, and detonator wire had been catalogued. They began to merge American technology with those mechanisms, pushing for faster response times, higher accuracy, more automation. The line between studying and replicating blurred until it vanished completely. The first American-built prototype, nicknamed Project Sentinel, fired in February. It wasn't an exact copy of the Flak 88. It was something new, something colder, a marriage of Allied mass production and German precision. The gun barked across the field, its shell rising into the icy sky before exploding in a perfect sphere of fire and shrapnel. The observers applauded, but the celebration was hollow. Even the young technicians sensed it. They were building their future from the bones of their enemy. The more they advanced, the more German the technology beneath their fingers began to feel. Major Haskins, overseeing the test, wrote in his log that night, "The echo of their war is becoming ours. We study their weapons so we can sleep at night, but each improvement feels like theft." Reynolds was there too, thinner than before, his eyes sunken from months of study. He had become the quiet conscience of the team. He watched the shell arcs through binoculars and muttered calculations under his breath, but his mind was elsewhere. What haunted him wasn't the engineering, it was the morality. He knew that every successful test brought them closer to understanding how the Germans had almost regained air control in 1945. He also knew that the same knowledge could one day be used again, under a different flag. When one of the younger scientists congratulated him after the test, Reynolds simply said, "You realize what we're celebrating, don't you? Perfection in killing." The young man looked away. In Washington, the reports from Aberdeen reached the newly formed Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board. They read like prophecy. The analysis confirmed that the Germans had nearly solved the problem of predictive anti-aircraft fire without radar. They had built mechanical brains out of metal and patience, analog minds that could calculate death in real time. The implications stunned the general. They saw not just what had been lost, but what could be gained. Plans began forming for guided missile, radar-assisted flak, and automatic fire control system. The Germans had laid the foundation, and now the Americans would build upon. The irony was almost too much to bear. The Reich's final weapon would not vanish in defeat. It would rise again under a new banner. At Aberdeen, the atmosphere grew darker. The firing tests became more secretive, the teams smaller. Orders arrived with sealed envelopes. Civilian engineers were replaced with military. One afternoon, a convoy of trucks arrived carrying new materials from the remnants of Peenemünde, crates filled with diagrams and parts recovered from underground factories. Inside one of them was a set of drawings for a flak computer designed to integrate proximity fuses with early radar input. Reynolds recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the engineer who had drafted the fuses they'd studied months earlier, a man who had likely died in an air raid while his work continued to shape the future. For a long time, Reynolds just stared at the paper. The more he read, the more he felt as though he were shaking hands with a ghost. Then came the test that changed everything. A joint demonstration for military brass and industry representatives. The gun was loaded with an experimental shell built using hybridized German-American technology. When it fired, the detonation occurred so precisely that the target drone ceased to exist, vaporized in midair. The shockwave rattled the stands. Applause followed, brief and uneasy. One general turned to another and whispered, "If they'd had 6 months more, we might have lost Europe." The other replied, "And now it's ours." That night, Reynolds walked the range alone. The sky was low and colorless, the kind that seemed to swallow sound. He stopped beside the gun, still warm from firing, its steel slick with condensation. He thought about the men who had built its original version, German technicians working by candlelight in tunnels beneath mountains, driven by fear, hunger, and orders they dared not question. He thought of the American crews who died above the Rhine, their planes cut to pieces by shells like the ones he now studied. He thought of how war had turned intelligence into currency and death into design. Somewhere between admiration and revulsion, he realized that history was repeating itself. Only the language had changed. Weeks later, Project Sentinel was formally absorbed into a new program under the War Department, the development of integrated air defense systems. The Germans had given them the spark. Now the Americans would build the fire. What no one mentioned, at least not out loud, was that the moral cost of this inheritance would never be paid. Each man involved carried his own version of that debt. Some rationalized it as progress. Others buried it beneath patriotism. Reynolds wrote one last note before leaving the project. "The gun that almost saved their skies will now guard ours. But every time it fires, I'll hear the echo of the past." In the years to come, the technology born from those tests would evolve into systems that defined modern warfare. Radar-guided flak, early missile prototypes, the seeds of anti-aircraft network, all traced back to the same origin, a captured German gun and the shells that had frightened the world. The Americans had not merely learned from their enemy, they had become custodians of his genius. Tell me in the comments, do you think progress justifies the cost of inheriting a weapon born from suffering? Right, we still live under its shadow. Time began to smooth the rough edges of victory, but for the men who had walked the proving grounds of Aberdeen, the memory of that German gun refused to fade. The reports had long been filed, the data absorbed into new projects with sanitized names like Enhanced Ordnance Efficiency and Air Defense Integration. The world had already begun dividing itself, drawing new lines across old scars. Yet the echo of those tests still followed them. For Reynolds, who had left the project soon after its final report, it came as a quiet unease that shadowed every lecture he gave at the university that later hired him. He spoke to young engineers about precision, about metallurgy, about the beauty of mechanical timing. But somewhere inside, he always heard the whistle of the 88's shell cutting through air, the impossible clarity of its detonation. He never mentioned the war, never mentioned the German fuse he had once taken apart 100 times over, as though its secrets could be separated from the suffering that had forged it. But late at night, when the house was still and his papers lay spread across the desk, he sometimes found himself sketching its internal mechanism again, tracing its logic as though it might reveal something human. It never did. It remained what it had always been, a perfect, inhuman answer to a question no one should have asked. For Haskins, who had stayed in the service, the story became something else entirely. Promotion followed promotion. And soon he found himself sitting in rooms where men in uniform spoke not of what had been learned, but of what could be done next. The Cold War was beginning to breathe through every corridor of the Pentagon. There were new enemies now, new skies to defend. The reports from Aberdeen resurfaced under classified initiatives, their conclusions stripped of moral weight and rewritten in the dry language of strategic potential. The phrases late German efficiency and mechanical proximity innovation appeared in briefings that led to the creation of the first automated radar-directed flak systems guarding American cities. To the generals, the origin of those designs mattered less than their usefulness. Haskins watched as diagrams once drawn by the hands of dead German engineers were redrafted under the US seal, the swastika replaced by an eagle. He told himself it was necessary, that progress could not afford sentiment, but part of him wondered if they were building safety or merely extending the reach of destruction. In his more honest moments, he admitted he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The gun itself, the original 88 used for the final tests, was never scrapped. It was moved to a storage hangar on the edge of the proving ground, its metal slowly gathering dust, its barrel wrapped in tarpaulin. Occasionally, a new group of ordnance students would visit the site and ask to see it. The guard would peel back the cover, revealing the long, elegant lines of its frame. They would stare at it in silence, uncertain whether to admire or despise it. One of them once asked Haskins why they kept it. He answered without hesitation, "Because it reminds us that genius and evil sometimes share the same hands." The student didn't reply. There wasn't anything to say. As the years passed, the legacy of the Flak 88 faded into textbooks and diagrams. To the world, it became another piece of military history, another artifact of a war too vast to fully comprehend. But for those who had stood on that range in 1945, it was more than that. It was a mirror, showing them the reflection of humanity's endless capacity to improve the means of its own destruction. Every modern anti-aircraft gun that rose from that lineage carried, hidden within its steel and circuitry, the memory of those desperate German engineers who had worked by torchlight in subterranean factories while the earth shook above them. The precision they achieved, born out of madness, had outlived them all. Sometimes, in quiet conversations between veterans of the testing division, the topic would return. Over drinks or letters, they'd mention the gun without explanation, as if speaking its name aloud might summon it back. They talked about how close it had been, how the war's final months could have turned differently if those shells had reached the front in greater numbers. And in their eyes, there was a strange mixture of gratitude, fear, gratitude that history had chosen them to be on the winning side, and fear that victory had not been as certain as the books would later claim. They spoke of it as one might speak of a near-death experience, a brush with something too immense to comprehend. What they could never quite express, but all felt in their bones, was the realization that war had evolved beyond the battlefield. The Flak 88 was proof that intelligence and cruelty were no longer separate forces. They had become intertwined, inseparable, feeding each other. Progress, once thought to be a promise of peace, had revealed itself as neutral, a tool waiting for the hand that would wield it. The scientists at Aberdeen had looked into that truth and found no comfort in it. Their discovery had changed how they saw invention itself. No design, no mechanism, no breakthrough could ever again be innocent. If you followed the story this far, take a second to leave a comment. Tell me if you think knowledge should have limits, or if progress must always go forward no matter what it costs. 2 decades later, the world had changed its shape again. The maps were redrawn, the enemies renamed, the battlefields replaced by screens and silos. Yet somewhere beneath all that noise of progress, the echo of that German gun still lived. Its pulse could be felt in radar dishes that swept the skies over Alaska, in missile silos buried under frozen ground, in the defensive networks that stitched the continental United States into an invisible shield. The technology had evolved, yes, but its ancestry was unmistakable. The lessons learned from that captured Flak 88, the fuse geometry, the timing algorithms, the predictive fire tables, had quietly become the DNA of modern air defense. The men who had once stood on the proving grounds were older now, grayer, scattered across universities, laboratories, and government offices. They rarely spoke of the weapon itself anymore, but in unguarded moments, when conversation drifted toward the war that had defined their youth, it always came back. The same quiet phrase, the 88, a name spoken not with nostalgia, but with the kind of reverence reserved for something that had revealed too much. Reynolds lived alone in a small house outside Boston. His students called him a relic of the analog age, a man whose lectures wandered between engineering principles and philosophy, who spoke of precision as though it carried a moral weight. He never mentioned Aberdeen directly, but every example he gave, every metaphor he built around the cost of invention, carried traces. Sometimes he would pause mid-sentence and look out the window as though listening to something. He had once told a colleague, during a rare conversation about his wartime work, that perfection was not the same as progress, that perfection, in the wrong hands, was a kind of abyss. His colleague had laughed it off, assuming it was poetic excess, but Reynolds meant every word. In his office, tucked in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet, he still kept the original German fuse he had been given to study in 1945. The metal had tarnished, the markings faded, yet it still felt alive in his hand, a small, silent artifact of the moment when humanity had looked into the mirror of its own ingenuity and flinched. Haskins's path had been different. He had risen high in the hierarchy of post-war defense, helping to establish the frameworks for what would become the nation's early warning system. He was decorated, respected, and haunted. The decisions he made helped protect millions, but the blueprints he signed carried the unmistakable fingerprints of an enemy he had once sworn to destroy. Late in life, during an interview that would never be broadcast, he admitted that every new layer of defense they built made him feel less secure. "We took their ideas," he said quietly, "and made them bigger, faster, smarter. But the more we built, the less I believed we were making anything safer. We just made it harder to stop." The interviewer didn't know what to do with that sentence. The tape was filed away, forgotten, but for Haskins, it was confession enough. By the 1960s, the Flak 88 was history, a museum piece in Europe, a training diagram in US military manuals, its name fading beneath the roar of jet engines and missile trail. Yet its spirit lingered in design rooms and laboratories, where engineers spoke of efficiency and kill probability, with the same language once used in the Reich's hidden factories. The men at Aberdeen had thought they were closing a chapter. Instead, they had written the prologue to a new kind of war, one fought by machines that could think faster, shoot farther, and kill without hesitation. The world had learned to fear the bomb, but few realized that the first true symbol of modern mechanized precision had not fallen from a plane. It had risen from a gun barrel built decades earlier by men who worked in darkness. In the quiet hours before sleep, Reynolds often wondered if history had a memory, if, in some cosmic way, every invention carried the ghost of its creator. When he read about missile systems in Vietnam, or the radar-controlled batteries stationed in Europe, he felt the same dull ache in his chest that had haunted him since Aberdeen. The progress he had once admired now felt like a contagion. Knowledge had spread, unstoppable, detached from conscience. The line between learning from evil and continuing its work had blurred beyond recognition. Sometimes he dreamed of the proving ground again, the sound of that first shell, the perfect detonation, the silence afterward that no one had dared to break. He would wake in the dark, heart racing, half expecting to hear it again. In the end, the men who had unlocked the Flak 88's secrets were remembered not as soldiers, but as architects of a new era. They had helped shape the foundations of modern defense, their contributions buried beneath layers of classification and time. But beneath the accolades and titles, each of them carried a quiet understanding that progress, once born of necessity, had become self-sustaining. The weapon that had almost cost them the skies had instead given birth to a future where the sky itself could never again be trusted. If this part of the story resonates with you, If you've ever wondered whether humanity's greatest inventions come with debts we never stop paying, leave a comment that says, "We carry their legacy, whether we want it or not." The gun sits now behind glass, its barrel polished, its wheels locked, a placard describing its specifications with clinical precision. To the visitors who pass through the museum, it is a relic of another age, a weapon stripped of its terror, reduced to numbers and calibers, 8.8 centimeters of history frozen in steel. Children walk past it with eyes wide, fathers explain its power with rehearsed pride, and old men stand quietly before it, their expressions unreadable. None of them know the sound it once made, the way the air trembled when it fired, the way a sky could seem to hold its breath before shattering. They see a machine. They do not see the ghosts that live inside it. Behind the polished metal and the careful lighting lies the sum of everything the 20th century became: intelligent, relentless, and incapable of forgetting how to destroy itself. Somewhere in a government archive, a file still bears the designation Aberdeen Analysis, 1940. Its pages are yellowed, the ink faded, but the numbers remain, cold and precise. Test results, fuse schematics, yield calculations, probabilities of kill. There is no mention of the men who ran the experiments, no space for the silence that followed each detonation. Bureaucracy has a way of erasing emotion, as though the moral residue of knowledge can be filed away along with the data. Yet between those pages, invisible but present, lies the heartbeat of that moment when the Americans realized how close they had come to losing the skies, not because their pilots lacked courage, but because their enemy's engineers had refused to stop thinking. The war had been won by attrition, by numbers, by time. Genius had not been defeated, it had only been interrupted. Decades later, as nations built missiles that could cross oceans and satellites that could watch the world turn, the Flak 88's lineage continued, unnoticed but intact. Its logic, the belief that precision can overcome chaos, had become the foundation of modern warfare. From radar-guided interceptors to computer-calibrated artillery, its DNA lived on. The weapon that once hunted bombers over Europe had given birth to 1,000 descendants. And through it all, the same silent principle endured: the pursuit of accuracy as salvation, the illusion that control over destruction could make it less monstrous. But those who had seen the beginning of that path knew better. They understood that precision did not redeem violence, it only refined it. When Reynolds died, the fuse he had kept all those years was found in a small wooden box on his desk. There was no note, no explanation, only the object itself, a piece of machinery small enough to fit in the palm, heavy enough to carry the weight of a lifetime. At his funeral, one of his former students spoke about innovation, about the importance of learning from history, about how engineers must always strive to understand both the science and the soul of what they build. He didn't know the full story, but somehow his words touched it. Haskins had died years earlier, his name quietly honored in defense circles, his contributions buried in classified reports. Between the two of them, they had embodied the contradiction of their time: the faith that knowledge was progress, and the fear that progress might one day erase what it meant to be human. The museum closes at dusk. The last light of the day falls across the 88's barrel, turning its steel to amber for a brief moment before the shadows take it back. Outside, the sky hums with the sound of distant engines, passenger planes now, peaceful, ordinary. But if one listens carefully, beyond the hum, beyond the safety of the modern world, there is still a faint echo of that other sky, the one filled with smoke and fire, where perfection was a weapon and silence followed every success. The world has moved on, but the lesson remains. Every machine carries the memory of the hands that built it, and every victory carries the price of the minds it borrowed to win. History doesn't end, it accumulates. The Flak 88, once the terror of the skies, is now just another artifact. And yet, in a way that can't be measured or catalogued, it still watches us. The line between what is remembered and what is repeated grows thinner with every new invention, every new war fought in the name of security, every engineer who mistakes mastery for meaning. That gun, silent now, is still speaking, not in the language of war, but in the quiet reminder that some knowledge, once gained, never truly lets us go. If you felt something reading this story, a chill, a thought, a question about the price of progress, like this video and subscribe, because some stories aren't just about the past, they're warnings about the future, written in the smoke of history's finest machines.